Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. My name is Christian Ramirez, and I'm the Public Programs Manager at Phoenix Art Museum. We really appreciate you all being here with us in this virtual space this evening. I'd like to give a big thank you to our museum members for their continued support, as well as those who have donated towards this Pay What You Wish program. We couldn't do what we do without you. I'd also like to note that Ansel Adams performing the print is on view until June 6, 2021. And Becky's latest book, which will be discussed this evening, Making a Photographer, The Early Works of Ansel Adams, is currently available through the museum gift shop. We hope that you're able to make it down to the museum to see the exhibition and grab a signed copy of her book. On a personal note, I'm just so thrilled to be able to have worked with Becky on bringing this program to the museum. Many, many moons ago, I was an intern at Phoenix Art Museum, and Becky was actually my supervisor. So it feels like a full circle moment to be able to introduce her today. And so, with all of that out of the way, I'd like to introduce Audrey Sands, who will be saying a few words before Becky begins. Audrey Sands joined Phoenix Art Museum and the Center for Creative Photography as the Norton Family Assistant Curator of Photography in 2019 after completing her PhD in art history at Yale University. Prior to that, she was the Chester Dale Fellow in the Department of Photographs at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. A specialist in 20th century European and North American photography, Dr. Sands has worked in curatorial departments of photography at numerous American museums, including the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., and the Museum of Modern Art in New York, and has contributed to numerous exhibitions and publications on the history of photography and modern art. So, thank you so much for being here, and I'm going to pass it over to Audrey.
Thank you, Christian, and thank you to everyone for joining us this evening. Tonight, it is my honor to introduce my distinguished colleague, Dr. Rebecca Senf. Although I'm sure that for many of you in the audience tonight, Becky needs little introduction, as she served as Norton Family Curator of Photography at Phoenix Art Museum for 10 years, from 2007 to 2017. Currently, Dr. Senf is Chief Curator at the Center for Creative Photography at the University of Arizona in Tucson. She earned her BA in art history at the University of Arizona. Her MA and her PhD were awarded by Boston University. Over the course of her career, Becky has curated nearly 50 exhibitions, 28 of which were at Phoenix Art Museum. In 2012, her book Reconstructing the View, The Grand Canyon Photographs of Mark Klett and Byron Wolfe was released by University of California Press. In 2017, her book To Be 13, showcasing the work of Betsy Schneider, was published by Radius Press and Phoenix Art Museum. Dr. Senf is internationally recognized for her scholarship on Ansel Adams. She has brought to the fields of photography and art history new insights on a multitude of aspects of Adams's work, beginning with her PhD dissertation and continuing over the past decade and a half through numerous exhibitions, scholarly articles, and books. In 2005, she co-organized the exhibition Ansel Adams in the Lane Collection at the MFA Boston. In 2010, she organized the major exhibition Ansel Adams Discoveries at Phoenix Art Museum, which featured nearly 150 fine prints, 75 archival objects, and a video slideshow. That same year, she opened Ansel Adams Arizona and the West at the Center for Creative Photography, University of Arizona, followed in 2011 by Ansel Adams The View from Here, also at CCP. In 2019, she organized Ansel Adams Examples for CCP's Heritage Gallery, and currently you can visit her most recent exhibition on Adams, Ansel Adams Performing the Print, on view at Phoenix Art Museum's Norton Gallery. She has also written and published extensively on Adams. Notably, she was co-author of the MFA Boston's exhibition catalog, Ansel Adams in the Lane Collection, which accompanied their major 2005 exhibition. In 2012, she was a contributor to Ansel Adams At the Water's Edge, published by the Peabody Essex Museum. And tonight, she will be sharing with you some highlights from her 2020 book on Ansel Adams's early years, titled Making a Photographer, The Early Work of Ansel Adams, co-published by the Center for Creative Photography and Yale University Press. Without further ado, allow me to introduce Dr. Rebecca Senft.
Thank you, Audrey, and thank you, Christian, and thank you all for joining us here tonight. I am really glad to have you here with us, and I only regret that we're not together in person at Phoenix Art Museum. I have such fond feelings about the museum and my times at the front of Whiteman Hall, and I just wish that that's where we were tonight. But we'll forge ahead and we'll get to talk about the book and some great Ansel Adams Arizona photography. So before I begin, I would just like to read a land acknowledgement. I am broadcasting from the University of Arizona, which sits on the original homelands of indigenous peoples who have stewarded this land since time immemorial. We recognize and acknowledge the people, culture, and history that make up our community. All right, let's begin. So tonight I'm going to be talking about my new publication, as Audrey and Christian mentioned. It's called Making a Photographer, the Early Work of Ansel Adams. And it is derived from the research I did on my dissertation at Boston University, all about Ansel Adams's early development. But it adds a chapter about his work for the national parks to help bring it to a meaningful conclusion. And in the book, I was really interested in thinking about this pair of pictures, or pictures like these two. On the left, we're looking at an Ansel Adams print from around 1920. It's in the collection of the Center for Creative Photography. And on the right, I imagine you'll recognize this image, Aspens, northern New Mexico from 1958. And I was interested in, how does Adams go from making a picture like the one on the left at the beginning of his career when he's about 18 years old, to making the picture on the right, which has all of these characteristics that signal to us the mature phase of his career with the qualities that we associate with an Ansel Adams. And so it was that kind of question that I was looking to answer with this research. And so I want to start out by defining what that signature style or mature style of Adams looks like. It was interesting, when I did the book, I realized that nobody had actually put words to what it is that makes an Ansel Adams look like an Ansel Adams. And of course, that's what art historians do, is put language to visual phenomenon in art. And so I want to talk about that, and then I'm actually going to read a short passage from the book that talks about this particular image, the Tetons and the Snake River. But what I'm going to talk about is the motives and the characteristics that help us recognize an Ansel Adams photograph. So Adams was interested in creating a heroic version of the landscape that was designed to emotionally engage us and get us thinking about his goals with making pictures, which was to help us imagine the transformative potential of the wilderness, or of nature in general. And he used certain stylistic characteristics to achieve this. One is a panoramic sweep of a distant landscape. Another is an omniscient perspective and point of view, so a godlike way of seeing a particular scene. He also used visual light and weather effects in order to help heighten that sense of drama and awe in the picture. And he used a very balanced range of gray tones. So we have bright whites in the highlights, we have deep dark blacks in the shadow areas, and there's a balanced sense of the grays in between, so that you have this sense of a kind of all over balance. And all of these characteristics were used to, as I said, emotionally engage us and have us become invested in the operatic, the emotional qualities of the picture. So what I'd like to do is read just a short passage about this particular image. Using the Tetons and the Snake River as an example, it is possible to describe these stylistic elements that Adams brought together to support his communicative goal. This photograph visually expresses the transformative potential of experiences in nature and the value of wilderness as an intrinsic good. In some, it presents a heroic vision of the American wilderness as an invaluable asset to its citizens. Adams chose a vantage point that facilitated a panoramic view of the Teton mountain range with the winding Snake River. The picture includes a swath of cloud-filled sky and distant mountains with patches of bright snow. In the mid-range, the silvery river curves through tree-covered banks. With little immediate foreground, Adams created a perspective that suggests his omniscient grasp of the scene, and as such implies that what is presented is made from the ideal position and is the best, or perhaps the only way this particular vista should be seen. It is a stylistic choice that imparts authority and gravity to the picture and confers importance on the subject. Adams favored landscape views that featured visible weather, such as snowstorms, billowing clouds, and rain. In some instances, his photographs include a wide band of sky to accommodate clouds, emphasizing an atmospheric expanse. In other cases, clouds and mist appear around landforms, creating depth within the three-dimensional space and helping to define the shape and appearance of the land itself, as with this image of clearing winter storm. One advantage of weather for Adams was its ephemeral nature. Clouds, rain, and snow are all temporal elements, and they impart a sense of transience and motion to Adams's necessarily still frames. In the Tetons and the Snake River, the sky glows behind dark storm clouds, and the left-hand portion of the mountains is bathed in sunlight, as is the surface of the Snake River, causing it to shimmer within the darker surrounding territory. Because of the changeability of the light and weather depicted, the viewer is aware that the scene Adams captured must not have looked like this for long, and indeed will never look exactly like this again. Thus, the viewer can both appreciate the magical qualities of spectacular clouds and illuminating rays as inspiring features of the natural world, and also attribute to Adams the ability to perceive and record just the right moment when the scene offered this exquisite combination of visual effects. A key component of Adams's mature style is an operatic treatment of his subject, a desire to heighten the dramatic qualities of the scene and create a photographic work of art that is both widely comprehensible and spectacular. In some instances, it is achieved by his use of viewpoint. At other times, it is light or weather effects that convey that engaging sense of drama. In some pictures, such as the Tetons and the Snake River, it is the use of powerful shifts in contrast, glittering passages of light interspersed with or appearing alongside areas of dense shadow or darkness. Adams's use of heightened contrast gives his images an engaging forcefulness, making his artworks bold and serious. The perception that the landscape is imbued with drama creates an expectation that the situation is not static and that viewers are observing a fleeting moment within an evolving situation. Adams's use of operatic and awe-inspiring qualities in his prints plays upon the expectation of viewers. The Tetons and the Snake River as a work of photographic art is impactful because the actual scene, when observed by a typical national park tourist, does not look like it does in Adams's picture. His complete set of skills in making the negative and the print coalesce to create an artwork that surpasses people's real-life experience, presenting an idealized, heroic version of what really exists, but one still rooted in the appearance of the scene. In so doing, Adams's artwork conveys not what he saw, but what he felt. Perhaps more importantly, they convey what Adams hoped his viewers would feel when faced with these landscapes that were deeply meaningful and inspiring to him. So that gives you a sense of how I've defined what makes an Ansel Adams an Ansel Adams. How do we recognize what a classic Ansel Adams picture looks like? So what I'd like to do now is step through the chapters of the book and just give you a basic outline of how I talk about Adams's early work. And then after that, we'll focus in on some specific Arizona pictures of Adams. So I start the book with Adams on his first trip to Yosemite National Park when he was a 14-year-old boy in 1916. And this introduction to Yosemite and defining what he's like as a tourist that very first summer he comes gives us a good starting point for thinking about who he will become as a photographer. This is a portrait of him around that time, holding the little box brownie camera that his parents had given him. It's a very rudimentary type of camera. And with it, he made pictures like these. So these are very small, square, as you can see, glossy prints that were commercially developed. And when he got back from the trip, he organized all of his pictures from Yosemite National Park into an album. And that album lives with us at the Center for Creative Photography in the Ansel Adams archive. And so I'm showing just one page of the pictures of Half Dome that Adams made as an example to show you the kind of pictures that are in that album. I think it's significant that we see him, even as a child, as a 14-year-old, thinking about the presentation of the photographs and organizing them very intentionally. So they're organized by geographic feature of the park. So all of the Half Dome pictures are together. And he actually organizes them from west to east. So as you would encounter these different features of the park. I also think it's significant to see him experimenting with photography. He's clearly not very accomplished yet. He's just beginning, and he is using very simple camera equipment. But you can see him playing with things like composition, framing, with lighting. The picture right in the middle, he's using the Half Dome is backlit with the sun as compared with the other pictures that are in more full light. He moves Half Dome around the picture. Sometimes it's in the upper right corner. Sometimes it's in the lower right corner. Sometimes it's all the way to the left. And so we see that he's beginning to grapple with what he can do as a photographer and what kind of control he has over the images. So this is our starting point. Pretty quickly, Adams develops a much more sophisticated engagement with the wilderness and with moving through it. So the second chapter really looks closely at the way in which Adams evolves into a mountaineer and goes from having a kind of regular middle-class vacation experience in Yosemite Park with swimming and game playing and hiking to learning about a type of extended backpacking and moving through the wilderness that involved a much more studied, deliberate, slow, intentional approach. So here we see him with a burro with two big boxes of camera equipment on either side. And often he would go into the wilderness with various mentors who were teaching him about what it meant to do these extended trips. He would be learning about the flora and fauna. He'd be learning about navigation and the geology of the mountains. And so this is where Adams really develops into a very sophisticated mountaineer and is also, along the way, developing his photographic skills. So now he's making pictures that look like this. This is a plate from his Parmelian prints of the High Sierras, his first professional portfolio that he produced in 1927. You can see what a very long way he's come from pictures in that childhood album 9 years before. But he's also playing with some modernist tenets. He's looking at the shapes and the forms within the picture as much as trying to describe the three-dimensional space. But he's beginning to think about how he might make pictures that are combined into a portfolio that's then for sale. And so this is a new way of approaching his photography. He's also beginning to have the kinds of transcendental experiences in the landscape that make him so passionate about photographing the wilderness. And it's a motive for him, but he doesn't yet know how to convey that through his photographs. The next chapter of the book looks at his work for the Sierra Club. The Sierra Club that we know today, this massive powerful international political action committee is not what it was in Adams's day. When Ansel Adams joined the Sierra Club, it really was a very cliquish, niche hiking club for people who wanted to go hiking in the Sierra Nevada mountains. That's where Sierra Club gets its name. And in 1928, Adams was hired to become their first official photographer of the summer outing, which was a month-long trip. It included as many as 200 people, all out in the wilderness, doing camping and fireside lectures and performances, and then doing some really spectacular mountain climbing. So in 1928, when Adams had his first year as official photographer, the group went to the Canadian Rockies. And so this is a picture of Mount Robeson that Adams made as part of that trip that was published in the Sierra Club Bulletin. And what we see here is Adams becoming more conscious and more intentional about who his audience is and creating photographs that will resonate with that audience and that will want to be purchased by that audience. So he's starting to think more intentionally about how he can sell the photographs he's making. The next chapter looks at Adams's pictures of Taos, Pueblo, and in particular, the way in which he published them as a book, a very high-end collectible book in 1930. Here we see him getting much more direct about thinking about who his audience is. Adams had joined two book collecting clubs, the Book Club of California and the Roxburgh Club. And through his association with this group of high-end book collectors, he learns about what kind of product might be attractive to that audience. And so unlike the Parmelian Prints portfolio, which doesn't sell out, Adams is able to completely sell out this very expensive publication in 1930 in the Depression, because he so perfectly fits the publication's qualities. It has beautiful leather and linen binding. It's got hand-set letterpress text. He's worked with Mary Austin, the Indian activist and author, who's produced a specific text for this book. And then he had the pages coated with photographic emulsion. So rather than being photogravures or images that were tipped in, he actually printed every one of the photographs in each of the 108 copies of the book by hand, so that all of the photographs that appear in the book are original photographic prints. So Adams is getting much more sophisticated about how he's approaching the practice of selling his work. The next chapter looks at his work for the Yosemite Park and Curry Company. And this, I think, in many ways may be the most important contribution I've made to Adams' scholarship, because while Adams was always very upfront about his lifelong engagement with commercial photography and really his need on commercial jobs in order to support himself, he never really reflected or analyzed what the impact of those jobs were. And so here I'm focusing on his 8-year relationship with Yosemite Park and Curry Company, which was the main concession in Yosemite National Park. They were the ones that ran the hotels and the restaurants and the provisioning. And if you wanted to go ice skating, you rented skates from the Yosemite Park and Curry Company. So Adams was hired to make pictures for them for all kinds of promotional purposes. They were sent out with press releases to news agencies. They were used in brochures. He made them into postcards. They were used for the cover of the daily menu at the Iwani dining room. And then they were also included in this publication. It's called The Four Seasons in Yosemite National Park. And it was a souvenir booklet that was sold in the national park gift shops. And it was a way for people to remember their trip, but also for Yosemite Park and Curry Company to encourage people to come back in other seasons. So most of the Yosemite National Park visitors came in the summer. But if you got this book and you looked at all the delightful things you could do in the spring, or particularly all of the winter sports and amusements that were available, then you might come back in the winter. And of course, that was what Yosemite Park and Curry Company wanted, because if their rooms are all full in the summer, you can't really make any more money by attracting more people to the park. But if you have rooms that are empty in the winter and you can get people to come and stay in the winter and spend their money on skiing and sledding and tobogganing and all the ways in which you can celebrate the deep snows of and the spectacular scenery of Yosemite in the winter, that was really to the concessions advantage. So Adams learned a lot through working for Yosemite Park and Curry Company. He reported directly to the marketing department and was actually guided by the advertising managers he worked for about how to make pictures that were clear, that conveyed a very specific, actionable message to potential vacationers at Yosemite National Park. So whereas Adams had previously had an idea of what he wanted to say, he didn't necessarily have the skills in order to make a picture that said what he wanted to say. And so by working for that long 8-year period in making pictures that were about advertising, he gained skills that were going to become very important as he moved back into his own personal work. We're looking here at a picture of Harold Ickes. He was the Secretary of the Interior under President Roosevelt. And in 1941, he hired Ansel Adams to do what's called the National Parks Project, sometimes referred to as the Mural Project. He wanted Ansel Adams to make photographs of the Western National Parks in order to illustrate the lands that the Department of Interior was responsible for. They had already commissioned a number of paintings that were hanging in the Department of Interior building. And when they first wrote to Adams, they said they wanted one or more photographic murals to adorn the building. But as Adams began sort of thinking about the project and what it would mean to him to be able to photograph the parklands and to put into practice the deep passion he had for the national parks and the value of being in the wilderness, he expanded the project and basically talked Harold Ickes into a more expansive project. So he ended up photographing throughout the Western United States and making pictures like the Tetons and the Snake River, which we were talking about earlier, as part of that federal commission. And I think this is the chapter with which I end the book. And the reason that I think it's so significant is that Adams is now bringing together all of these learnings from decades of photography and experiences of making portfolios and making books, and is now able to all at once make pictures of a subject he feels deeply passionate about. He's making the pictures for a very clear audience, but it's also a very broad audience. It's the American people. And he knows what the product is going to be. It's going to be these large scale murals in the Department of Interior building. And so he also has the skills to create a stylistic language for conveying this message about the importance of the parks to this broad public audience. And so we see his style change when he starts working in 1941, photographing the national parks, and he continues to use this stylistic language for the rest of his life. And it is that stylistic language that we associate with Adams's mature work, his signature style. Unfortunately, because of the United States entry into World War II, those original photographic murals were never made. So Adams went on to get a Guggenheim grant in order to continue photographing in the national parks and to continue the project with the places he hadn't yet been. So now I want to talk a bit about Adams's work for Arizona Highways. And I'm imagining that some of the audience may be familiar with the magazine Arizona Highways. It was founded in 1925, and originally it had articles about road construction, and it was actually designed for engineers and contractors who wanted to know about the state of the roads in Arizona. This was the era of more and more people having automobiles and the beginnings of more extensive road travel. But in 1937, the magazine got a new editor, a man named Raymond Carlson, and he really transformed it into the magazine that we know today, the tourist publication that features spectacular photography from the state of Arizona. We're looking here at an edition of the magazine which Adams photographed for the cover, Sanovir Mission. And it's interesting, Arizona Highways was a real history maker in terms of color photography in magazines. In December of 1946, it made history by publishing the first nationally circulated magazine with full color on every page. So it's interesting that our own Arizona publication has this really important first in terms of magazine publications. And Arizona Highways actually became a real pioneer in color printing technology because of this early entry into color magazines. So what I'm going to do is show you just a few of the magazines that Ansel Adams contributed to, but I'll talk a little bit more in depth about two of the publications. This one about Sanovir Mission, and then another one about Death Valley. But in November of 1951, Ansel Adams wrote to Raymond Carlson, the Arizona Highways editor, saying that he wanted to do a series of regional books with his friend and colleague Nancy Newhall. And he said in his letter, quote, "So many Southwest books are so dull and factual, so lacking in imaginative imagery, that we feel the opportunity exists for us to apply what pictures we have, new pictures, and a high order of editing and writing to the structure of a new kind of book." So he's basically suggesting to Raymond Carlson that Arizona Highways could hire them to do articles for the magazine, which they could then expand into book-length treatments. And Adams says the money would be very helpful for the travel and expenses for, quote, "the persistent obligations of hearth and larder," end quote. And I imagine that Adams was just over the moon when Carlson wrote back just 8 days later, and he said, quote, "As editor of the magazine, I have never been as proud as when I have had the opportunity on rare occasions to present your work. Frankly, we would be interested in anything you would care to send along. The name of Ansel Adams in our magazine adds worth, character, and value to our publication," end quote. So Adams suggested a range of thematic ideas like the development of a thunderstorm or sunrise on the desert. He suggested studies of Arizona towns like Jerome and Tombstone. He suggested features on natural wonders like Sunset Crater, Monument Valley, and the Grand Canyon. For the Grand Canyon, he suggested that he could do intimate trail details, fossils, and plant forms. He also mentioned Fort Logan and Denver, Colorado. And then some of his ideas were actually things he'd photographed before, like the Enchanted Mesa near Acoma in New Mexico, or Inscription Rock, also in New Mexico, and the Santuario de Chimayo in New Mexico. And so he was thinking that he could expand on these subjects that he'd already photographed. Now, naturally, Raymond Carlson was more interested in the Arizona subjects, since it's called Arizona Highways. And ultimately, Adams and Newhall did 7 stories in the magazine. And so the very first one was in this June of 52 issue. This is not Adams's image on the cover, I'm afraid to say. But you can see on the inside of the cover, Raymond Carlson introduces Ansel Adams and Nancy Newhall. You can see their portraits there. And he says, quote, "Ansel Adams, one of America's truly distinguished photographers, will be with us quite regularly from now on to interpret and help us wrap up our country with his camera. Nancy Newhall, whose husband is curator of the George Eastman House at Rochester, New York, and in her own right, a recognized authority on photography, will supply interpretive texts. And so that first issue, they did a piece on Canyon de Chelly, and the article included photographs from Adams's 1941 trip with the National Parks Project, pictures from his 1947 trip to Canyon de Chelly on the Guggenheim Foundation funding, and then again, photographs he'd made just the year before in anticipation of this article. Then the next article that appears, again, not Adams's image on the cover, was a piece about Sunset Crater National Monument in Arizona, and it was just 4 pages of the magazine, so really a very brief article in that instance. This is July of '52. The next article that he did was about the ruins at Tumakakri Mission, and this is from November of 1952, also not Adams's image on the cover. Another relatively brief article, but with more images from Adams. And then the next article is Death Valley. And so this is the October 1953 issue. And this is a much more expansive piece in the magazine. It's interesting because, of course, Death Valley is not in Arizona, it's in California. But it was a subject that was really interesting to Adams, particularly through his relationship with Edward Weston. He talked about how he had introduced the Sierra Nevada mountains to Edward Weston, and Edward Weston had introduced him to Death Valley. And I think for Adams, Death Valley was a very challenging subject. Adams, as we know, tends to focus on light and weather, and the dry, arid environment of Death Valley was hard for Adams to work in. I want to zoom in on this picture that accompanies the opening page of the story. It's important to remember that at this point, Arizona Highways is a tourist publication, and so they need to make this very inhospitable place seem somewhat more welcoming and as a potential for a tourist destination. So you can see in this image, Adams has these teeny tiny figures of people out in the landscape. They're hardly perceptible, but they are there, showing that this is a place that you can go and visit. In her text, Nancy Newhall talks about this picture and how confounding the sense of scale is in Death Valley, that it's really so hard to appreciate how vast the spaces are. And she talks about, I have a quote here, she's talking about the white streaks of the salt flats that we're seeing in this picture. She says, quote, "They look smooth at first, mere dried deposits on the desert floor. Actually, they are beds of jagged rock crystals, 3 or 4 feet high, interspersed with pools and creeks of crystalline brine." And this picture shows you those same salt formations down at the valley level, so that you can see what Nancy Newhall is describing, that these salt flats are actually these jagged, almost forest-like formations. Adams also accompanied the article with tips for photographing, and we see this beautiful dune picture in color, which Adams also printed in black and white. But he, among his photographic advice, talks about the dangers of Death Valley. And he says, quote, "Never go blithely off photographing over the hills without first getting your bearings by the sun and the huge salient landmarks. A car can become a surprisingly small object to find in Death Valley," end quote. So the next article he does is this one on the Organ Pipe Cactus National Monument. And I decided to show you all these magazine covers, even though they're not by Adams, because they're so charming. And I think they give you a good sense of what Arizona Highways looked like and felt like during this era. But do notice the chicks in the lower left corner of the cover image, a cactus wren who has come back to her cholla nest to feed her babies. Then the last article that I want to talk about is the Sanovir Mission. And here we're seeing on the right-hand side a little introduction again from Raymond Carlson. He writes these little editorial notes on the inside cover. And he introduces the article that Nancy Newhall and Ansel Adams have created. He says, quote, Ansel Adams with his sensitive camera and Nancy Newhall with her deft prose have joined their talents to portray in all of its romance and all of its beauty the white dove of the desert. As far as we know, this is the most complete coverage of this engrossing subject that has ever been done. At least this humble publication has never told the story of Sanovir so well before. So we see on the cover, this is now Ansel Adams's image. And maybe when I come back during the Q&A, I have a copy of the magazine here, so I'll show you so you can get a sense of the scale. So Adams photographed at Sanovir. He had photographed there previously, and there are these little illustrations throughout the article, as you can see, by Ted DeGrazia that are also part of the story. The pictures alternate between black and white and color. This is a 2-page spread of the facade of Sanovir Mission. And then this is another 2-page spread with a detail you can see of this wonderful buttress, and then all of these color details of the interior of the mission church. And it's funny to me how sort of raucous all of these colors look when they come together, and interesting to think about Adams functioning as a color photographer. But of course, for this magazine that was known for its color imagery, this all would have been very important. So Adams is illustrating the physical elements of the church itself, and then he also includes portraits of some of the worshipers there and of the ministers of the church as well. And then the final piece that Adams did, along with Nancy Newhall for Arizona Highways, was this one that was published over a decade after they submitted it in April of 1968. And it's called Mary Austin's Country. And it uses quotations from Mary Austin's writings along with Ansel Adams's pictures, and then illustrations that were drawn from her publications. And Adams had worked with Mary Austin on that earlier Taos Pueblo book. And so this was a way for him to honor her and to recognize her important contribution to his own career. Only 2 of those ultimately did turn into books, as Adams initially had proposed it might when he talked to Raymond Carlson. So we're seeing there's a Death Valley book, and then on the right, there was a Mission Sanovir del Bac book, which those of you in the audience who know Dr. Schaefer may know that when this book by Adams went out of print, then John Schaefer made the new photographs of the mission, which became the new tourist publication for people who wanted to buy a book about Sanovir. But I think all of these stories, whether or not they became book-length treatments or not, really deepened Adams's connection to Arizona. He had already had a very strong bond at this point with New Mexico, having worked extensively in northern New Mexico in his 20s and having produced that really important Taos Pueblo book there in 1930. But this allowed him to extend the time that he spent in Arizona and really allowed him to work with a number of sites in Arizona and in Tucson. And so it's hard to say exactly, but I'm sure it contributed in part to that deepened connection and familiarity with Arizona when Dr. Schaefer did approach Ansel Adams about his archive coming to the University of Arizona. So I like to think about the connection between Arizona Highways and the archive of Adams's work at the CCP in Tucson. So what I'm going to do next is read about Adams's most famous picture, Moonrise, Hernandez, New Mexico, from my book. But this is the last thing that I'm going to do, and then we'll have plenty of time for me to answer questions. So be thinking about what questions you may have for me, and we'll look at Moonrise, and then I'll come back and talk with you. Moonrise, Hernandez, New Mexico, 1941. By far, Adams's most famous photograph is Moonrise, Hernandez, New Mexico. Oft told, the story of its making is one of photographic legend. The creation of the Moonrise negative happened on a trip when he was accompanied by his son Michael and his friend Cedric Wright. And that's what we're looking at in this portrait here. That's Michael as an 8-year-old sitting on the hatchback of the truck, Cedric Wright in the middle, and Ansel Adams standing to the right. And this is them loading up the truck with all the supplies for the road trip. And this is the road trip on which Adams is going to be making photographs for the Department of Interior of the national parks. They had been making photographs without much success in the Chama River Valley near Georgia O'Keeffe's Ghost Ranch in northern New Mexico. Driving back to Santa Fe, Adams hastily responded to what he saw before him. Quote, "In the east, the moon was rising over distant clouds and snow peaks, and in the west, the late afternoon sun glanced over a south-flowing cloud bank and blazed a brilliant white upon the crosses in the church cemetery." End quote. With the sun setting, he knew he had to act fast. Swerving his station wagon to the side of the road, he commanded his son and Wright to help him set up his 8x10-inch view camera. Tripod, camera body, lens board, lens, dark cloth, loaded film holder, and light meter had to be pulled out and assembled before he could frame and focus the view, made all the more urgent by the rapid descent of the November sun. In the frantic hustle, the light meter could not be found. Evaluating the scene before him, Adams miraculously remembered the luminance of the full moon, 250 candles per square foot, and was able to approximate an exposure for the scene. He released the shutter and captured the clouds, moon, and mountains beyond the little town of Hernandez. Before he could make a second backup negative, the sun dipped below the horizon and the opportunity was gone. With that single negative, Adams preserved a view that has become a photographic icon. The image at its core exhibits many of his mature stylistic elements. Adams filled the frame with a vast expanse of sky, the moon hovering above a bank of horizontally striated clouds and a long, low chain of mountains. He placed the chapel and cross-filled graveyard of Hernandez in the middle ground, bounded by a shrub-filled plain. The picture features a panoramic sweep of landscape and compellingly asserts that this perspective, with its precise arrangement of human edifice within a monumental and impressive environment, is the critical viewpoint for observing the scene. The drama comes in part from the relative scale of the elements. The endless quality of the sky reminds viewers of how small and seemingly insignificant we are in the expanse of the universe. All of these qualities serve to inspire in the viewer a sense of awe in the face of a spectacular and unique visual experience, an appreciation for the natural scene, and a feeling of amazement. Unlike the mountain pictures of the late 1920s and 1930s found in his Parmelian Prints portfolio or his Sierra Club album, Moonrise clearly conveys Adams's intensity of experience, his message about the transcendental possibilities for people when they are immersed in nature, and his deep appreciation for the American landscape. This slide compares his final print on the left to his proof print on the right. The proof print is a straight or unaltered printing from the negative with no darkroom work, such as dodging or burning, that allows the manipulation of exposure to select areas of a print. As such, it affords a view of Hernandez that is much closer to the one Adams originally observed, albeit in black and white. From this view of the landscape, he envisioned, or to use his parlance, visualized, the finished artwork of Moonrise, Hernandez, New Mexico. Moonrise existed only in his imagination. He photographed a raw scene that he could transform in the darkroom into a symbol that would convey how he felt under a vast and beautiful New Mexico sky. By altering the relationship of the sky and the graveyard of the Hernandez Chapel to create a dark expanse over a shimmering village burial ground, Adams created from the raw material of the landscape an emotionally engaging image, one that borders on magic or mysticism. On that November day, Adams drew on more than 2 decades of wilderness exploration and photographic experience to create what would become his masterpiece. Deep and repeated contemplation had etched in him the value and meaning of immersing oneself in nature. Equally ingrained were lessons about making photographs that effectively convey an essential idea. Adams's early years had readied him for the scene he discovered along the highway as the sun set over northern New Mexico. Thank you very much. So I will stop sharing and come back. And I think Audrey will join us so that we can take some questions. And just as I mentioned, here's the Arizona Highways magazine to give you a sense of the scale of it. It's a big publication. There's another one of Adams's pictures from the Sanovir story.
Thanks so much, Becky. I wanted to actually begin with a question of my own for you. You emphasized that nature, the wilderness, national parks, from Yosemite to Arizona to Death Valley to New Mexico, was, as you've demonstrated, central to, in fact, defining of Adams's work and practice. As a scholar, what place did nature or spending time in nature have for you in your research and your coming to appreciate and understand Adams?
That's a fun question. I grew up in Arizona, in Tucson, and my dad was an amateur photographer who was very much inspired by Ansel Adams. My mom actually literally last week gave me an Ansel Adams wall calendar from when I was a kid. She was cleaning out the house. And my dad would sit at sunset and look at the Catalina Mountains, and it was called Sun on the Mountain Time. And as kids, we were allowed to join him, but it was a quiet time. It wasn't for talking, it was for looking and for watching. And I think through that process of watching the way that the colors of the light on the mountain looked, the way the shadows changed as the sun set, the kind of very subtle differences that my dad was visually engaging with, I learned a kind of visual acuity, an appreciation for the way nature looks and the way that we can experience its beauty. So that was ingrained in me very young as a child. And then in doing the research for the Ansel Adams exhibition at the MFA Boston, we traveled to California. We went to Yosemite National Park. We went to Los Angeles. We met with Adams's assistants and his family, and got a sense of what those places were like. And then I returned to Yosemite several times. And even, I would say, even during the writing of the book, I found that the hiking that I was doing and the way that I was experiencing nature on my own those experiences. So I think it all adds together.
Wonderful. We have a question from Robert Sherwin, who asks, did Ansel Adams ever photograph east of the Mississippi?
He did, not a lot, but when he got the Guggenheim Foundation grant, part of what he wanted to do was photograph national parks on the East Coast. So he photographed Shenandoah in Virginia, the Great Smoky Mountains in Tennessee. He photographed Acadia in Maine. But in addition to that, Adams had a very close relationship with Edwin Land at Polaroid Corporation and did a lot of work with Polaroid. And so he was in Massachusetts with some regularity visiting Edwin Land. And so there are Massachusetts photographs. And then he also, Adams, helped to found the Department of Photography at the Museum of Modern Art. And so there are New York City pictures as well. So he traveled to the Eastern United States with some regularity, and there are photographs from those trips as well, including a bunch of New England burial ground headstone pictures, which probably people aren't familiar with, but those are on the CCP's website. If you search Ansel Adams in our online gallery, you can find those gravestone pictures too.
Wow. I'm just curious, as a follow-up, what were Ansel Adams's New York City pictures like? What caught his eye?
He was mostly photographing architecture. There's a picture made from Central Park. I think it's towards Central Park West, where he's photographing the architecture along the park, but from the middle of the park. And he actually at one point proposed to photograph one of the streets in Manhattan from one end of the island to the other in a very Ed Ruschian approach, which he never did, but it's fascinating to imagine him thinking about trying to photographically chronicle his experience of the architecture of Manhattan.
Wow, that's fascinating. We have another question from Martin Reiki, who says, "Great to see the color images from the Arizona highways. Did Ansel keep the same control of the final color image as he did with his black and white work?"
Yeah, hi Martin, nice to have you here with us. I don't think he could. I mean, truthfully, I just don't think there was as much control to be had with color printing as there was with black and white. As we know, Adams became very knowledgeable and very invested in photomechanical reproduction in order to better represent his work in books and magazines. But I think that he trusted Raymond Carlson. Raymond Carlson had a particular look for the magazine, and that had more to do with how the images were reproduced than Adams's particular vision for what the images would be like. But as I said, I just don't think that, I think that in many ways, the controls over color printing at mid-century were pretty clunky. I've done some work on Louise Dahl Wolfe and her color photography in fashion for Harper's Bazaar. You could control some things very broadly, but you did not have a lot of fine control over the printed image.
Becky, I've got another question for you. And that is, you talked early on at the beginning of your talk about Ansel Adams's signature style and your process a bit of uncovering what those characteristics were. How has your understanding of Adams evolved over the course of your career researching his work, and what has surprised you to discover?
So certainly the most steep period of learning about Adams began when I was hired for the Ansel Adams exhibition, and Karen and I began our research. I was responsible for trying to find every place Adams's work had been published. So we created a database of all the places the pictures in the Lane collection had appeared. As I said, we were meeting his assistants. We were visiting the location of his photographs. And then following that, I did my dissertation research. So I spent weeks and weeks here in Tucson in the center's archive reading correspondence. I visited archives in Yosemite, in New Mexico, at the Huntington in Los Angeles, where the Mary Austin archive is. And so, I came to it with a hypothesis about the impact of the National Parks Project on Adams, and that was the moment where all of his thinking about photography coalesced into this new style. So I was pretty sure that was true, because there's a big change around 1940, but I wasn't sure what had led to it. And so my research helped me get to that progression that I described tonight about these various experiences he had and the way in which he learned from his own successes and he learned from his failures in order to build into the photographer that we know. I defended my dissertation in 2007, and then a month later came to the CCP and began my work as a curator there. And over the years, as Audrey kindly mentioned, I curated a number of Ansel Adams shows. And truthfully, as much as I might have liked to have done this book sooner than 17 years after I started my research, having all of that time was a real advantage, because time and again, I could go to the archive and learn, or put together an exhibition, or work with primary source materials and check my work, test myself, are those theories that I had when I started, do I still believe them? Are they still right? Is the new data that I've gained support the theories that I have, as well as the data I found at first? And so by the time I published the book, I could feel so confident that my theories were right, because I'd had over a decade to continue testing them and to know that this wasn't just a young scholar putting forth an argument, but really was a good reflection of who Adams was and what had happened in those early years in a way that nobody else had talked about before.
Amazing. We have a question from Marcelo Esquer, who asks, what was Ansel's favorite place or most photographed to photograph in Arizona?
Probably most photographed is the Sanovir Mission, because it was a kind of small site where he could concentrate and do a lot of pictures. He made pictures in Saguaro National Monument. I sort of imagine that his favorite place to photograph was Monument Valley. Although, certainly he made pictures in Canyon de Chelly, but I feel like, and he made pictures at the Grand Canyon, of course, but I think the Grand Canyon was a really hard subject for someone who cut his teeth photographically in Yosemite National Park, where there's Half Dome and there's Bridal Veil Falls and there's El Capitan, and what you're making a photograph of, what's important. The Grand Canyon is really hard. It's so vast and it doesn't have a central focal point. So I don't think Grand Canyon was probably his favorite. So I think the monumentality and the kind of clear vistas of both Monument Valley and Canyon de Chelly, I think particularly appeal to him.
Another question. Were there later editions of the book Man of Taos printed, and is it available today?
So there was a later edition. So he published the first one in 1930, an edition of 108, and it was sold for $75, which is in today's dollars over $1,000. So it was a very expensive book. Then in 1977, they produced a facsimile edition, which was the same large scale. It came in a slipcover. It was still a very high-end publication. I don't remember what they charged for it, but both books are still circulate on the secondary market. Certainly the facsimiles are much easier to come by than the originals. Most of the 108 copies that I've located during my research are in institutions or in private collections where they're not likely to move. But I think those facsimile copies are easier to come by. I would poke around on like ABE Books, and you might check eBay and see what you can find. It's fun to poke around. There are all kinds of Adams things that are out there, like the postcards and the Awani menus and the coffee can that he did for Hills Brothers. There's lots of good collectible Adams stuff.
Some great insider tips on collecting Ansel Adams. We've got a question from Mark Zettler, who says, what do you think Adams might think of the digital age and the ability we have today to manipulate photographs? That is, what do you think he might think of the digital age and the ability we have to manipulate photographs today?
Yeah. I think I feel very certain that he would be excited about digital technology, particularly because of the way in which it gives us control. The thing about color photography that frustrated him in his own personal work was that he didn't have the control that he had when he was in his own darkroom printing. And so I think the notion that you could make a digital photograph in color or in black and white and literally change it at a pixel level would have been very exciting to him. And he was someone who adopted technology with great fervor throughout his life. So he always was looking to new cameras. As I said, he worked with Edwin Land on the Polaroid cameras. He tried new films. He experimented with developers, but he also he was so excited when he traded his typewriter for one of those early word processors. I don't know if people here remember that, but it was like a kind of a cross between a rudimentary computer and a typewriter where you could type in several lines and check that they were accurate and then hit print, and it would print that paragraph or those lines. So he was really very excited about gadgets. He was a real gearhead. So I think he would like it. And there's a part of me that even imagines that he might love Instagram, that we'd be getting pictures from Ansel's travels around, and I don't know, probably the occasional picture of a really beautiful lunch. I think that's possible.
I'm seeing notice that we have time for one final question if anyone has one for Becky.
Maybe not. Maybe everyone is perfectly sated.
Well, what a wonderful conversation, and thank you to everyone who joined us tonight, and thank you so much to Becky for your wonderful talk and your engaging responses. We do have one more question just in the nick of time. Aside from Edward Weston, Paul Strand, and his buddies from F-64, were there artists who influenced Adams's work?
So Adams was someone who was really cognizant of the people who'd come before him. I think he always wanted to be very respectful and pay homage to the people who had influenced him. So when you think about Yosemite, you have to think about people like Edward Muybridge and people like George Fisk, who's a much less famous Yosemite photographer, but someone that Adams felt was really a very good Yosemite photographer, and talks about George Fisk's influence. His colleagues in the Sierra Club, many of them were amateur mountain photographers, and I think in his very early development, he was looking at those pictures, and that influenced what he thought mountain photography should look like in those early years. So, I mean, I think in many ways he was, especially through those first few decades, influenced and open to ideas from other photographers. But when we hit that 1941 point where he starts making the national parks pictures, we're now seeing his own fully formed idea about what photography should be. And that's the point at which then he becomes an influence on other photographers, and which of course we still see to this day, lots of people who are influenced by Adams and his photography.
Wonderful.
I also want to thank everybody for coming. I got a chance to see the RSVP list, and so I know I have lots of friends and former Phoenix Art Museum photography supporters out there, and it's nice to be with you virtually, even though we can't be together in person. So thank you all so much for coming and spending some time with me.